So there are certain people who are required by law to be at the IEP team meeting, the Individualized Education Program team meeting. Now, what we don't want to overlook, that probably the most important person to be at that team meeting, when appropriate, is the child.
That's right. And the statute says, Julie, that it's when appropriate. It's the last listed member that should be at the IEP team, and it says when appropriate, the child with a disability. And that's a really important piece of language. Now, this is one of those situations where state law varies a little bit from federal law on occasion, because your state may define the age at which children with disabilities are required by law to be invited to their IEP team meetings. But this doesn't necessarily mean that they're required to be there, even though they're required to be invited. And as far as I'm concerned, it's within the discretion of the parent up until the student reaches the age of majority to make the decision about whether or not the child attends the meeting.
Right. And I think there's so many variables in how in the real world this works out. I know in my experience, certainly you might not, if you're having an IEP team meeting for a kindergartner, it might not be appropriate for your kindergartner to be at the meeting. Okay, so now let's say a kid is getting a little older, but you may not want that child to be at the entire IEP team meeting. So you may elect to bring that child in at the end to explain, here's what we decided.
Or at the beginning to say, what's your input into this document? You know, as a student gets older, obviously they're getting closer to adulthood, closer to wanting to have a say in their education, and that's all well and good. And as you said, and as I've said many times before, you have to look at a number of factors. What's going on in the child's education? Are things going swimmingly at that point? Does this child advocate for himself or herself? Should they be at the meeting for that reason, is to work on self-advocacy? Another factor for when I get involved, because there's a dispute, sometimes, unfortunately, I find that school districts will capitalize on a child, usually a teenager's, desire to not have anything to do with the services that they're required to get. Because at a certain age, all teenagers just want to be like everybody else, and I don't want to have to go to speech, and I don't want to have to go to this. And they capitalize on that by saying, well, you know, he's saying he doesn't want more services. Well, sometimes a 14-year-old doesn't know what's good for him or her. I certainly didn't when I was 14, And so I say to parents, sometimes you have to make a judgment call as to whether or not it might actually be more harmful to your ultimate case to have him or her there if they're going to undermine your position. Because right now it really is up to you. Until a student reaches the age of majority, the parent holds the child's special education rights. At the age of majority, there's a transfer of those rights, which we can talk about another time. But really, it's up to the parent at that point, you know. And I'm Italian. I was raised, you know, until you're a certain age, you don't have any say. You know, so again, it depends on what kind of a parent you are.
Well, you know what it comes down to, Jen? It's a very individualized decision based on so many factors, and it's why the IEP is called an IEP. It's an individualized education program, and certainly this is also a decision that has to be very individualized.